The wind that night had teeth. It came down from the northern hills in long, icy breaths, carrying dust fine as flour that stung the eyes and whispered against the walls of Cedar Bluff's lone cafe. Inside, the room was dim, the air thick with the smell of overbrewed coffee and wood smoke that clung to the rafters. The stove hissed as wet logs settled in the iron belly, and a half-dozen townsfolk nursed drinks with the slow, deliberate motions of people trying to make the warmth last. Elias Monroe sat in the corner booth, shoulders hunched against the cold, hat pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. He wasn't much for company, but the long ride from his south pasture had left his stomach hollow. The plate in front of him steamed with the kind of simple meal he favored: sliced salt beef, potatoes fried with onions, and a thick heel of bread that still smelled of yeast. The door banged open against the wind, every head turned, and the draft rolled in with the figure standing in the doorway. The man's coat was the color of old ash, frayed at the cuffs, and so thin it barely deserved the name. Beneath it, his frame was all bone and sinew, the kind of leanness that came from too many days without a full meal. His hair hung in black ropes past his jaw, dusted with snow, and his eyes, dark, sharp, swept the room in a single measured glance. Nobody greeted him, nobody offered a seat. The stranger stepped inside without asking, boots dripping meltwater onto the warped floorboards. He moved like a man conserving his strength, his hands bare in the cold. The cook behind the counter, a broad woman named Hazel, straightened. "Kitchen's closed," she said. Her voice was flat, but her eyes betrayed the discomfort she was trying to hide. The man didn't answer. He stopped near the stove, letting the heat touch him, and for a long moment he stood perfectly still, like an animal that had found the edge of a campfire, but wasn't sure it was welcome. Elias felt the eyes of the room turn back to their drinks and plates, the subtle shift that comes when folks decide to ignore something. He'd seen it before, on trails, in towns, in saloons where men lay bleeding while card games continued unbroken. He looked down at his own plate, still full, still hot. Before he could talk himself out of it, Elias pushed the plate across the table. The legs of the chair opposite him scraped the floor as he nudged it out. The man's gaze landed on him, not startled, just measuring. Then, without a word, the stranger crossed the space and sat down. He didn't thank Elias, not aloud. He simply picked up the fork and began to eat with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to waste a single bite. He chewed slow, swallowing between sips of the tin cup of water Elias slid his way. Around them, the cafe noise returned in hesitant murmurs. Hazel pretended to wipe the counter, though her eyes kept flicking toward the corner booth. Elias leaned back, arms folded, watching the man work through the meal. He was young, no more than 30, but the lines at the corners of his mouth spoke of winters that had worn deeper than his years. They didn't speak. Elias preferred it that way. Words had a way of obligating a man, and this seemed a night for quiet. When the plate was clean, the stranger set down the fork with deliberate care, as though returning a borrowed tool. His eyes met Elias's, and for the briefest second, something passed between them. A flicker of acknowledgement, not gratitude exactly, but a kind of recognition. Then he stood, buttoned the coat tight around his ribs, and walked out into the wind without a backward glance. The door banged shut. The cold followed him out. Elias finished the last of his coffee, left a coin for Hazel, and stepped into the night. The wind had not eased. It dragged at his coat and filled the spaces between his collar and skin with a knife's-edge chill, above, the moon rode low behind thin clouds, casting a milky sheen over the hard-packed street. By the time he reached his horse, he had already filed the stranger away in the same mental drawer as wayward coyotes and lost cattle, unfortunate but passing. He mounted up, turned south toward his ranch, and rode into the dark. Hours later, Elias woke with a start. The fire in the bedroom stove had burned low, leaving the air brittle and cold. For a moment he thought it was the wind again, until he heard it, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for his own heartbeat at first. Then another and another, until the rhythm formed. Dum, 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 dum. It came from far off, carried on the wind from the hills beyond the cottonwoods. A steady, deliberate pulse, like the beating of a great drum somewhere deep in the earth. Elias swung his legs out of bed, the floorboards icy beneath his bare feet. He crossed to the window and lifted the curtain. The moonlight silvered the snow in the yard. Beyond the fence line, the land rolled into shadow. There was nothing to see, no firelight, no riders. But the sound persisted, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to grow more distinct the longer he listened. Dum, 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 dum. Elias frowned. He'd heard drums before, at gatherings, in celebrations, but never here, never at night, and never from that direction. The rhythm was unhurried, like a signal meant for those who already knew its meaning. He thought of the stranger in the cafe, the way those dark eyes had taken in the room, the way he had eaten, not like a man in passing, but like a man regaining strength. Dum, 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 dum. The horses in the corral shifted restlessly, their shapes just visible in the moonlight. One stamped and tossed its head. Elias reached for the rifle leaning by the window, the wood familiar under his hand. The drums went on. He told himself it was nothing. Some boys from town, maybe, fooling around out in the hills. But the sound carried a weight that pressed into his bones, a weight that made the night feel older than it was. Dum, 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 dum. It took him longer than he liked to realize the rhythm wasn't fading. It was moving, circling, like a predator testing a perimeter, and each time it came back around, it seemed closer. Elias pulled on his boots, slipped into his coat, and stepped out into the yard. The wind cut sharp, and the air smelled of wood smoke drifting from the direction of Cedar Bluff. The snow underfoot squeaked with the cold, each step loud in the stillness. He turned his head toward the sound, but the darkness gave up no secrets, just the drums, patient and relentless. That was when he saw it, a single figure, standing at the edge of the trees, barely more than a silhouette against the snow. Tall, motionless, watching. The drum beats faltered once, as if marking his attention, then resumed. Elias felt the weight of the rifle in his hands, the familiar tension coiling in his shoulders. But before he could move, the figure melted back into the trees without a sound. The night swallowed it whole, and the drums kept playing. Dawn came thin and brittle, a ribbon of pale gold laid across frost-stiff grass. The Monroe place sat quiet under it. Fences rimed white. The water in the trough skinned over with ice, so clear it mirrored Elias's breath when he cracked it with the heel of his glove. The night's drumbeat had faded sometime before first light, but it left a pressure in the air, as if the sound still waited, just beyond what a man could hear. He had nearly convinced himself it had been wind and nerves when a shape peeled off the cottonwoods behind the barn and stepped into the washed-out morning. The coat was the same ash color, but lighter now, and the face beneath it was younger than Elias had guessed. a lean-boned man with a thin scar like a white thread along his jaw. His palms were empty and up, and he moved with a careful respect that said he knew exactly how close a rancher kept his rifle to hand. "You ate," Elias said. His voice sounded larger than he meant in the quiet. The stranger's mouth tipped in a small, almost embarrassed not smile. "You gave," he answered, words spaced like planks on a bridge he didn't trust to hold. His English wrote a different cadence, vowels rounded, the syntax touched by another language. "I pay now. Warning. Warning about what?" The man's eyes slid past Elias toward the barn roof, where the frost was already beating and running. "Drums," he said softly, "not for dance, for counting." Elias felt the day's first true cold there, not in his fingers, but in the meat of his chest. "Counting what?" "Time," the stranger said, "until men come. Your town, my people, blood if no speak." He looked back at Elias, and there was nothing dramatic in it, no theater, just a hard, frank offering. "You fed me, I tell you true." A crow hopped along the fence post to Elias's right, glossy and black as spilled oil. Somewhere out on the flats a calf bleated thinly for its dam. Elias kept his eyes on the stranger and stepped, once, slow, toward the barn. "You look about froze to the bone," he said. "Come out of the wind." Inside, the barn held its own winter, cold but not biting, and fragrant with hay and horse. Sunlight knifed through gaps in the boards and spun dust into drifting gold. Elias's bay gelding lifted his head, nostrils flaring, then settled when Elias brushed a palm down his nose. The stranger stood by the tack bench as if the planks were holy ground. He didn't sit without being told. He didn't touch what wasn't his. Elias poured coffee from the small barn pot he kept on a brick shelf and handed it over. The man took it in both hands, breathing in the steam like it was warmth itself. "What's your name?" Elias asked. The stranger considered the question like a puzzle, with two right answers. "They call me Ista," he said at last. "Snow that melts too fast. My mother hoped I would not stay to bring trouble." Something like a wryness flickered in his eyes and was gone. "Elias," he said. Ista nodded once. "Elias." He sipped and closed his eyes as if the heat threaded him together from the inside. When he spoke again, it was more certain. "I listened last night. Drums say, gather, watch, no raid, not yet. But someone pushes." He flattened his palm and slid it forward, as if shoving a board. "White law, your men." Elias leaned a shoulder against the stall, the leather creak and the horses slow chewing the only other sounds. "We've had squabbles, water, fence lines, but no war, not for years." Ista lifted his hand, thumb crooked toward the scar on his jaw. "Water becomes war if men who want war make it so." He set down the tin cup and pointed with two fingers to his eyes, then to the barn's back wall, past it to the cottonwoods. "I saw riders after you left town. 3. They looked at your place like wolves nose a pen. One had a badge sun in his chest." He hesitated, searching for a word. "Yellow Star." Elias's tongue went dry. "Maddox, though, or one of his boys." "You saw where they went?" Ista shook his head. "I hid. Men who search for fight, they find what they search for." He glanced at Elias's rifle leaned in the corner. "You hold a good gun. But if guns talk before mouths do, drums will answer, loud." A gust shouldered the barn. The door rattled on its hook. Elias watched Ista set the cup down with both hands, like he was returning a prayer. "Why, tell me," Elias asked. "You could have kept walking." Ista's answer was simple. "A man gave me his bread. In my language, that is a rope tied between us. If I cut that rope, wolves eat both." The words hit with the blunt weight of something older than the fence posts in the valley. Elias pushed away from the stall and pulled a red bandana from his coat pocket. He'd carried that scrap for years, habit and utility. He twisted it once and pressed it into Ista's hands. "Wrap your fingers," he said. "You'll keep more heat that way." Ista turned the cloth over, the red bright as a wound against his burned knuckles. He tied it with quick, competent motions. "Red means safe," he said, in that same low voice, not quite to himself. "At night, fire sees this far." He looked up. "I will borrow this. I will give it back." "You keep it," Elias said, and surprised himself by meaning it. The bay stomped, head turned toward the crack of light under the door. Elias crossed the packed dirt aisle and lifted the latch. The cold walked in with a new smell, creosote and wood smoke blown from the north. Over the stable roof, he saw 2 distant riders posted on the ridge like punctuation marks on a long sentence. They were too far to name, but the way they sat their horses, square, easy, read like confidence. He felt the decision arrive before he heard himself speak it. "If the sheriff comes sniffing, and he will, I'll have questions stacked like cordwood. A man could answer honest and still hang for it." He cut a look at Esta. "So I'll ask you plain, are those drums calling peace or calling war?" Ista's gaze didn't flinch. "They call hunger. Winter stole too much. 2. We lost 6 old. 3 small. We come to the river to fish. Your men closed the bank." He made the pushing gesture again. "Someone wants our anger full. Someone wants your fear fat." "Who?" "My chief will say the name," Ista said. "I am only feet to carry the words. But I know this. Drums last night were not ours alone." He put 2 fingers together and tapped them twice, a rhythm that matched Elias's memory from the dark. Another hand, offbeat, farther. That means someone plays pretend. The hair on Elias's arms lifted. A second drum. A second hand making a lie sound like truth. A shadow crossed the barn mouth. Quick, then gone. Ista stepped back from the light without being told, his profile already thinning into the stall's dim. Elias set the coffee on the bench and picked up the rifle. "Neighbor," he said, too quietly. Or not. The knock on the door wasn't a knock. It was the open and lean of a man who believed no door could keep him out. Harlan Fitch slid in with his hat canted and his breath smoking. He was trail-thin, all elbows and grin, a rancher of sorts, though he spent more days in town than among cattle. He sniffed the air like a dog at a cook fire. "Smells like you got company, Eli," he drawled. "Thought I'd borrow your small Y brand. Got a frisky yearling won't hold to his mama." Elias didn't move. "Brand's in the tack box. You can borrow it. You can bring it back." He didn't offer coffee. He didn't smile. Fitch's eyes flicked the room like a lizard's tongue. "Heard a drum last night," he said, casual as a man remarking on weather. "Heard more'n one, if you ask me." He turned his head, listening, as if the barn itself might admit something. "Sheriff says we keep eyes peeled. Says a man can do his civic duty by looking over his neighbor's fence now and then." "Sheriff can do his own peeking," Elias said. He let his voice go flat and iron. "A man's belly ain't a crime in this county. Not yet." Fitch's grin sharpened. "Didn't say it was. Just saying. Times get curious, Eli. Folks talk. They recall who shares plates with who. He palmed the little iron from the box, testing its weight. Town council meets at noon. Maddox wants tempers neat before they get messy. I'm obliged to pass along friendly advice. Don't give the law cause to come riding your direction. Friendly advice considered, Elias said. He let silence fill the rest. Fitch's gaze snagged on something red where the stallboards didn't quite meet. Just a whisper of bandana, bright as a flag. He didn't get to it. Elias stepped once and set the butt of the rifle down with a sound like a mallet hitting a tent peg. "Brand," he said, and pointed. "Door." Fitch measured him, appetite and caution like two dogs tugging at the same bone. He tipped his hat instead, a lazy, sarcastic thing, and ambled out, flipping the latch behind him with a knuckle. His whistle faded into the cold. Ista exhaled. It was almost a laugh and almost not. "He smells like fox," he said, licks the blood, runs from the teeth. Elias set the rifle back in its corner and listened hard. The Ridge Riders had gone, but the morning seemed to press closer now. He looked at Ista. "You said if no one speaks, blood will come. Who do I speak to?" "My chief," Ista said, "at the river crossing where willow bends like woman's hair." He traced a line in the dust with a fingertip, a map any boy could read. Before full sun, after that. He let the thought die. Bring food, not for honoring, for need. "How many?" Ista's eyes slid toward the door, as if he could see through it, to all the miles and hungry bellies between here and there. "How many can you carry?" he asked without shame. There it was, the choice opening like a canyon at his feet. Feed strangers at the edge of an uneasy winter and make himself a target for a town itching for an excuse, or turn his back and let hunger answer with violence. Elias thought of the drums that were not quite theirs, of the sheriff's easy threats, of Harlan Fitch's fox smile, and of a red bandana bright as a promise in another man's hands. He nodded once. "I'll hitch the buckboard." He paused. "You coming?" Ista shook his head. "I am seen with you. Your law says you choose a side. Better you say, I go because I am decent, not I go because I follow him." He stepped backward into the gray seam where stall shadow swallowed the light, and it seemed to Elias that he was unmaking himself, a man becoming suggestion. "I will watch," he said. "If someone pushes, I pull you back. And if I don't see you again, then you gave bread to a ghost," Ista said, the hint of that not smile returning. He touched two fingers to the red at his wrist. "But ghosts pay their debts." The barn door opened on a day that had found its color. Frost was giving up the fences. Breath rose in plumes from the gelding's nostrils. From far off, too far to name but near enough to feel, came a faint, deliberate thrum. Dum, 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 dum. Elias stood a long moment and let it settle into him like a nail finding the grain. He hitched the buckboard, loaded sacks of dried beans and cornmeal, jerky, 2 wheels of hard cheese, and the flour Hazel had sold him cheap last month. He tucked his rifle under the seat and tied down a canvas. When he turned to close the barn, the stall where Ista had stood was empty. Only the faint rasp of hay settling, and a single red thread from the bandana snagged on a splinter, proved he'd been real. On the ridge above the cottonwoods, a flash of light pricked and died, sun on metal. Not a rifle barrel, a badge. Elias set his boot on the buckboard step, feeling the wood cold through the sole. The drums were counting something all right. What they were counting down to, he was about to find out. The sun was barely above the ridge when the first sign of trouble appeared. A slow-moving rider on a bay mare, hat brim low, dust hanging in the cold air behind him like smoke. Elias Monroe was repairing the hinge on his barn door, the metal cold under his fingers, when the rider turned onto his lane. Sheriff Maddox. The lawman was built like a fence post, straight, narrow, and weathered from years of standing in the sun, but there was nothing brittle about him. His eyes were pale as creek ice, and just as forgiving. 2 deputies followed close, younger men with the easy arrogance of those who carried a badge and believed it put them above the dust and sweat of common folk. "Morning, Elias," Maddox called, reining up in front of the barn. His voice was slow, almost pleasant, but Elias had lived in the territory long enough to hear the iron under it. "Morning, Sheriff," Elias replied, setting the hinge aside. "To what do I owe the visit?" Maddox swung down from the saddle, boots crunching in the frost. "We had word you were in town last night. The cafe, Hazel's place." Elias wiped his hands on a rag. "Stopped in for supper. Weather was turning bad." Maddox nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on Elias's face. "Witnesses say you shared that supper with a vagrant. Tall fellow, dark hair, skin the color of river clay." The description landed between them like a thrown knife. Elias didn't flinch. "Man was hungry," he said. "Looked like he hadn't eaten in days." "And you just gave him your plate." Maddox's tone made it sound like an accusation. Elias shrugged. "Wasn't using it." The deputies exchanged glances. Maddox took a slow step closer. "That vagrant is a known member of the nation. Some say he's been involved in recent troubles, missing cattle, burned homesteads. There's talk he's tied to a band planning something big." Elias leaned against the barn door, the wood rough under his palm. "Talk's cheap, Sheriff, and I didn't see him steal any cattle. I saw him eat supper." "You didn't ask where he came from, where he was going?" Maddox asked. "No," Elias said. "Didn't seem my business." Maddox studied him for a long moment. The cold seemed to press harder in the silence, the wind carrying the faint rattle of the cottonwoods. "Everything's your business when it comes to keeping this county safe," the sheriff finally said. "You break bread with a man, you're telling the world you're on his side. Sometimes that can be dangerous." Elias met his gaze. "Or sometimes it's just being human." The deputies shifted, boots scraping on frozen dirt. Maddox's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his ear. "I'll give you a word of advice, Elias. Be careful who you share a table with. The nation's been restless. You hear drums in the night. It's not a good sign." Elias didn't answer. The sheriff stepped back and swung into the saddle. "If you see your supper guest again, you let me know," he said, "for everyone's safety." The 3 of them rode off down the lane, leaving only hoof prints and the faint stink of suspicion behind. Elias stood there until the dust settled, the rag still in his hand. Drums in the night. Maddox had said it like a warning, but Elias remembered the sound from the darkness before dawn, steady, patient, as if marking time for something he couldn't yet see. By midday, the wind had shifted, bringing the scent of wood smoke from the east. Elias was in the north pasture when he spotted movement by the tree line. A figure stood half in shadow, watching the ranch. The same tall, dark-haired man from the cafe. The Beggar. Elias rested his hands on the top rail of the fence. "You've got a habit of showing up uninvited." The man stepped into the light. He was wrapped in a worn blanket, his eyes sharp and restless. "You gave me food," he said. His voice was accented, the syllables careful. Now I give you warning. Elias frowned. About what? The man's gaze slid toward the distant hills. The drums mean they are coming, not for me, for all of this. He gestured to the pasture, the barn, the low sprawl of the house. Who's coming? The man shook his head. Too many words, and you will not believe. But you will hear them again tonight. Louder. Before Elias could press him, the man glanced toward the road. They are watching you. The ones in badges. You tell them nothing. He started to turn away. Wait, Elias called. You didn't tell me your name. The man paused, eyes narrowing as if weighing something. Then he said, Toman, and vanished into the cottonwoods, as if the trees had swallowed him. Elias stayed by the fence long after he was gone, the wind cold in his collar. The name rolled through his mind like a stone in a river. Toman, and the sound of drums getting closer. That night, as the first stars crept over the ridge, Elias sat by the stove with a cup of coffee, gone lukewarm. Outside, the frost was already silvering the grass. The house was quiet enough that he could hear the slow tick of the cooling stovepipe. Then faint at first, the drums began again. They came from the same direction as before, but this time the rhythm was different, no longer patient. It was quicker now, urgent, as if the hills themselves had picked up their pace. The hairs on the back of Elias's neck lifted. The sound threaded through the dark until it felt as though it was inside the house, inside his bones. And somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, he thought he saw a flicker of light, not lantern light. Fire. The night had teeth. Elias Monroe knew it before the moon cleared the hills. Even the air felt wrong, thin, restless, carrying scents from too far away. The coyotes had gone quiet. Horses in the corral shifted and stamped like they'd caught wind of something moving just beyond the tree line. He stepped out onto the porch, Winchester cradled loosely in his arms. The boards under his boots groaned in the cold, every sound too loud in the stillness. A mile out, the land rolled down toward the cottonwoods where the creek wound through black soil. That's where he heard it. Drums. Not the faint murmur from the night before, but closer, sharper, like a pulse quickening in the dark. The rhythm was different now, heavy and insistent, as if it meant to draw him toward it. The livestock's unease spread. Cattle huddled near the fence, their breath steaming. The gelding he favored for range work, a calm buckskin named Jasper, kept throwing his head toward the eastern ridge and snorting. Elias's gaze followed the horse's unease. Between the bare winter trees, shadows moved, tall, slow shapes, too steady to be animals. He felt it in his gut before his eyes confirmed it. Someone was out there. He left the porch and moved along the fence, boots whispering over frost-bitten grass. The cold bit through his coat. His breath came in white clouds. From the corner of his eye, a shadow detached from the tree line and took form in the moonlight. It was the Beggar. Toman, the same man he'd fed in town, the one the sheriff had warned him about. Wrapped in a ragged blanket, he stood just inside the open field, watching Elias without moving closer. You pick strange hours to visit, Elias called quietly. Toman didn't answer right away. The drum beats seemed to ride the silence between them, neither loud nor faint, just steady, as if they'd been there forever. They are not for me, Toman said finally. His voice carried on the cold air like smoke. They are for you. A warning. Elias's fingers tightened on the Winchester. From who? from those who do not come as friends. They watch already. This night, only the edges. Tomorrow, closer. You planning to explain why? Elias asked. Toman's gaze slid past him toward the house. Your kindness in town was seen. Kindness makes enemies when the wrong eyes watch. Before Elias could ask more, the man stepped back into the darkness, swallowed by the trees so quickly it was as if he'd never been there. The drums kept on. They seemed to follow him into the house, thrumming faintly through the walls. He stoked the fire higher, but the heat felt thin. A restlessness had settled in his chest, the kind a man gets before a storm, or, by around midnight, the wind rose. Loose shutters rattled. From the back window he caught another flicker of movement, more than one figure this time, slipping between the cottonwoods. The moonlight glinted off something in their hands. Elias lifted the rifle and sighted along the barrel, but they were gone before he could fix on them. The hairs along his arms prickled. He wasn't alone tonight. By the second hour after midnight, the drums had shifted again. Faster now, almost urgent. Elias sat at the kitchen table, oiling his rifle with slow, methodical care. Every creak of the old house made him glance toward the door. The knock, when it came, wasn't loud. Just 2 quick raps. He swung the rifle up before he moved, keeping the stock snug in his shoulder as he opened the door a crack. A young woman stood there, native, wrapped in a dark wool shawl, her eyes sharp and wary. Snowflakes clung to her hair. "They sent me," she said, voice low. "You need to leave before dawn." "Who sent you?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is you fed the wrong man in the wrong place. Now they think you've chosen a side." The wind tugged at her shawl, showing a knife hilt at her belt. She glanced over her shoulder toward the ridge. Drums mean they're gathering. By the next moonrise, they'll come down from the hills. "Who's they?" She didn't answer, only stepped back into the cold. "If you stay, you'll die here. Maybe not tonight, but soon." Before Elias could press her, she melted into the dark just as Toman had. He stood in the doorway long after she vanished, the cold biting at his cheeks, the drum beats carrying across the land like a heartbeat that belonged to someone or something else. Behind him, the fire popped, throwing sparks. He shut the door, bolted it, and sat in the nearest chair, but he didn't put the rifle down. The wind shifted again, bringing the faint smell of wood smoke from the ridge. He pictured the sheriff's pale eyes, the way Maddox had warned him, "Be careful who you share a table with." Now the table seemed to have chosen him. Around 3, the drums stopped, just gone. The silence was worse. Elias stepped to the front window, pulling the curtain back an inch. The moonlight silvered the pasture. Nothing moved. The tree line lay quiet, shadows deep and still. Then a flicker of orange bloomed on the far ridge, small at first, then growing into a line of fires. His chest tightened. They weren't random. They were placed in a ring. And in the shifting glow of the flames, he saw figures moving, dozens of them, some dancing, some standing with spears or rifles, all turned toward the valley where his ranch sat like a lone island. And there, among them, stood Toman. He raised something into the firelight. It was Elias's red bandana, the one he'd lost weeks back while mending fence on the north line. The gesture wasn't casual. It was a signal. Elias stayed there in the dark, watching the flames paint the sky, knowing whatever game had started with a simple plate of food was only now revealing its rules. He let the curtain fall. The rest of the night passed without another sound. But Elias didn't sleep, because he knew, when the drums started again, they'd be closer, and next time, they wouldn't stop until they reached his door. The wind that night carried the smell of smoke long before Elias saw it. He had been pacing the edge of his porch for the better part of an hour, rifle balanced in the crook of his arm, when the first faint thread of it drifted down from the hills. The drums had started again just after sundown, low at first, like distant thunder, but now they were louder, rolling through the cold air in a cadence that set his teeth on edge. It wasn't music. It was a summons. He saddled Jasper under a sky that had turned hard and bright with stars, each one sharp as broken glass. The gelding shifted uneasily as Elias swung into the saddle, ears flicking toward the ridge. The sound of the drums seemed to pull at the animal, the way a river's current pulls at a boat. Elias kept a steady hand on the reins, guiding them toward the source. Frost cracked under hoof, each step magnifying the silence between beats. The closer he rode, the more the land seemed to change, less familiar, more watchful. The cottonwoods gave way to bare hills, their slopes etched in pale light. Somewhere ahead, a shadow moved, and for a moment Elias thought he saw the beggar, Toman, half-turned, as if waiting. Then the figure was gone, swallowed by the dark. When he crested the ridge, the valley opened before him. There were fires down there, dozens of them. They formed a wide ring in the snow-packed clearing, each one burning clean and bright. The flames swayed in the night wind, casting long shadows that moved like living things. Around them, men and women moved in time to the drum beats, slow, deliberate steps, bodies turning with the precision of something older than the territory itself. Warriors in painted faces and feathered braids, women draped in blankets heavy with beadwork, children standing just beyond the light, eyes wide. And at the center, framed by the largest fire, stood the beggar. Toman looked nothing like the man Elias had met in Hazel's cafe. Gone was the ash-colored coat and the hunched, starved posture. He wore a dark deerskin shirt, fringed at the sleeves, a bone choker at his throat, and his hair was bound back with a strip of red cloth, Elias's red bandana. The same one he'd given him in the barn to warm his fingers, now tied around Toman's arm, bright in the firelight like fresh blood. Beside him stood an elderly man whose presence reached even to the ridge. His hair was long and silver, braided with eagle feathers, and though he leaned on a carved staff, his back was straight, his gaze fixed on the circle before him. He wore no war paint, but the weight of authority hung on him like armor. Elias felt the meaning hit him before he understood it. The bandana was no simple keepsake. It was a sign, a mark. Toman lifted the cloth high above his head, and the circle of dancers stilled. Every face turned toward him, then toward the ridge. Elias didn't have to move to know they were looking straight at him. The drums did not stop, but their rhythm changed. Slower now, heavier, each beat like a hand on his chest. Something in him wanted to ride down there, to demand an explanation. But another part, the part that had spent years keeping to himself and avoiding other men's fights, told him he was already in it, whether he liked it or not. From the shadows at the edge of the firelight, another man stepped forward. He carried a long spear decorated with crow feathers, and when he pointed it toward the ridge, the fire caught on its steel tip. The gesture was not threatening. It was deliberate, like the passing of a message. Elias's hand tightened on the reins. The gelding shifted under him, hooves scuffing the frozen ground. In the valley, the elder raised his staff and spoke in a voice that carried up the slope, not loud, but shaped to be heard. Elias couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. An address, a call, the naming of something decided. Toman stepped forward and dropped the bandana into the largest fire. It caught instantly, flaring bright enough to paint the elder's face in gold. The crowd murmured in one voice, a sound that was neither cheer nor chant, but something in between. Ritual, binding, acceptance. Elias's gut told him it was about him. He thought of the sheriff's pale eyes, the warning in his voice. Be careful who you share a table with. He thought of Harlan Fitch sniffing around the barn, eyes catching that flash of red. And he thought of the woman who'd come to his door in the night, telling him he'd chosen a side without knowing it. Now looking down into the valley, Elias realized they'd all been right. A rider broke from the circle, galloping hard toward the far hills. A messenger. Elias's stomach turned. Whatever had just happened here, the word of it was already on its way to someone else. Someone who might not see it as a sign of peace. The drums picked up speed again, filling the air until it seemed like the ground itself was keeping time. Elias backed Jasper a few steps, meaning to turn away from the ridge before anyone decided to ride up and meet him halfway. But movement caught his eye. On the opposite slope, half hidden among the rocks, 3 riders sat their horses in absolute stillness. No firelight touched them, but Elias could see the faint gleam of metal, rifle barrels angled toward the valley. Their hats and coats were the cut of townsmen, not warriors. One leaned forward, speaking to the other 2, and though Elias couldn't hear the words, he knew the posture. Reporting, confirming, planning. Maddox's men. He felt the cold settle in his chest, deeper than the wind. If they'd seen what he'd just seen, the bandana raised, the fire, the gathered warriors, then word would reach Cedar Bluff by morning that Elias Monroe had been marked in front of a war party. And once that word took root, it wouldn't matter what he'd actually done. The town would believe what it wanted. The sheriff would make sure of that. The riders turned their mounts and vanished into the night. Elias stayed on the ridge a moment longer, watching the fires burn. The drums shifted again, their beat following him as he wheeled Jasper away and started down the back trail toward home. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time the ranch came into view, the rhythm was still in his ears, as steady as his own heartbeat. And he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been set in motion in that valley, it was already too late to stop it. From somewhere far behind him, a single drum beat cracked the night like a gunshot. Dumb. Then silence. Elias didn't sleep. The first gray breath of dawn crept over the hills, brushing the frost-slick earth in a pale, cold light. Elias Boone stood in the open, coat collar turned up against the bight, the butt of his rifle warm in his palm. The prairie was still, too still, except for the slow, deliberate clop of approaching hooves. Whoever was coming had no reason to hide. They wanted to be seen. From the ridge to the east, riders emerged one by one, silhouettes cutting black against the paling sky. 10 of them, maybe 12. The man in front wore a dark frock coat despite the dust, a cavalry saber swinging at his side, and a gold braid catching the morning light. Colonel Vance Mercer, territorial enforcer, land speculator, and the sort of man who signed death warrants with the same care he gave to polishing his boots. Behind Elias, the yard was quiet, too quiet. Mary and the child were hidden in the root cellar, the Apache boy crouched beside them with a knife at the ready. The others had taken positions out of sight. It would look like he was standing alone. Mercer reined in 20 paces away, his horse snorting clouds into the cold air. "Boone," he called, voice smooth as a whetstone, "you've taken something that belongs to the territory. I've come to take it back." Elias said nothing, watching the men spread into a loose half-circle, a tactic to hem him in without spooking him into firing first. Their rifles stayed low, but their fingers twitched near the triggers. "What you've got," Mercer went on, "is a fugitive savage and the woman who's been helping him. You know the law, Boone. You hand them over, we ride away. You keep them, and the ground here'll be wet with more than just morning dew." The air was sharp enough to cut. Elias could hear the leather creak as Mercer shifted in the saddle, the jingle of bit chains. He could smell the horses, the tang of oiled steel, and underneath it, the faint smoke from a fire someone had doused before riding in. "You've got no warrant," Elias said finally, his voice low but carrying. "And no right." Mercer smiled, thin, humorless. "Out here, right's what a man can hold on to. You planning to hold on?" A movement caught Elias's eye. Yanni, the Apache youth, stepping out from the barn's shadow. He moved like someone who'd already decided what dying was worth. In his hand, the knife glinted once in the dawn. Gasps rippled through Mercer's men, some shifted in the saddle. Elias knew that was the moment. Hesitation was the only currency they had. "Colonel," Elias said, "if you want him, you're riding into a fight you can't win." Mercer's gaze slid from Elias to Yanni and back, calculating. "You think those few in the shadows can match trained rifles?" Elias didn't answer. He just shifted his stance, so the barrel of his Winchester lifted a fraction. A subtle signal. Behind the wind's low moan, the sharp click of rifles being cocked answered him from the brush and fence line. His people, Apache and settler alike, had taken their aim. The first crack came from the ridge. Dirt spat up inches from Mercer's horse's forehoof. Not a kill shot, a warning. The air changed. Men's hands tightened on reins. Mercer's jaw set. "Last chance, Boone." Elias thought of the cellar beneath the kitchen, of Mary clutching the child, of what Mercer's justice meant. He thought of how easy it would be to step aside and live quiet again. Then he thought of the old war stories, how men lived with themselves after they'd stood still when standing meant something. He lowered his voice so only Mercer could hear. "You step forward, and none of you ride home." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Mercer's eyes narrowed. He raised his hand slightly, a signal to his men. The first shot cracked the dawn. Elias dropped to one knee, fired, and saw a man topple from his saddle. Chaos bloomed, horses rearing, gunfire shattering the stillness, the smell of powder burning into the cold air. Yanni darted forward, a blur of motion, dragging one of the dismounted rifles into cover. Elias cycled his lever and fired again, and another rider spun away. Mercer wheeled his horse, shouting orders, but every movement was met with fire from the hidden positions. What should have been an overwhelming show of force had turned into a staggered retreat behind the bodies of fallen horses. A shout went up from the edge of the yard, a second wave. Elias's stomach tightened. More riders, cresting the rise, sunlight catching their gun barrels. These were fresh, not yet blooded by the first exchange, and they'd flank the yard in minutes. "Fall back," Elias yelled to the shadows. "Cellar and east wall." Yanni hesitated, then nodded, slipping into cover. Elias fired again, buying seconds, feeling the hammer's recoil bite into his shoulder. Mercer had pulled back to the second group, conferring with a man in a lieutenant's coat. He wasn't retreating. He was setting the field. The sun's rim touched the far hills, and the light spilled gold across the frost. Elias's breath smoked as he sighted down his rifle one more time, on Mercer's gold braid glinting like a target. He didn't fire. Not yet. Killing Mercer here would bring the whole territorial army down before noon. This had to end another way. Then he saw it. A rider breaking from the second wave, carrying something small in his arms. A child. The rider was young, barely more than a boy, face pale with fear. He was steering straight toward Mercer. The moment twisted. Elias understood. Mercer wasn't here just for the fugitives. He'd brought leverage. Ayani saw it too. His knuckles whitened around the rifle. That's his son. He breathed. Mercer rode forward to meet the boy, took the child, and turned back toward Elias with a smile that had nothing of humor. "You've got something I want," he called, "and now I've got something you can't afford to lose." Elias's jaw clenched. The lines had been drawn in gunpowder and blood, and Mercer had just set a match to them. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of horses, powder, and something else. The coming storm of choices no man could walk back from. The river was a black ribbon under the morning light, its surface slow and cold, carrying thin panes of ice like glass, drifting on a current. Elias reined Jasper to a halt at the crossing. On the far bank, the valley opened into a stand of willows bent low from years of wind, their branches trailing like hair in the water. From between them, a small party emerged. 6 riders moving with the steady pace of men who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. In front rode the elderly chief Elias had seen by the firelight the night before. Even at this distance, the man's bearing was unmistakable, straight-backed, eyes like flint, under a sky-colored blanket draped over his shoulders. Toman was there, too, no longer cloaked in rags, but wearing the same deerskin shirt and red bandana at his arm. His gaze found Elias, and he gave the smallest nod, as if to say, "You made it." They met in the middle of the ford, water lapping at Jasper's knees, the cold numbing through Elias's boots. The chief studied him a long moment before speaking, his voice deep and steady in a way that seemed to carry more than words. "You are the one who gave bread to my son," he said, and it took Elias a heartbeat to realize he meant Toman. "I fed a hungry man," Elias answered. "Didn't know it'd bring me here." The chief's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in the measuring way a man looks at timber before building with it. "The drums are not a call for war. They are a warning. Your sheriff sends men to the edge of our land. They take the fish from the river, the wood from the grove. They take without speaking. We come to speak now." Elias glanced over his shoulder at the hills behind him. The air was clean, the wind carrying only the scent of water and pine. No gunpowder yet. "If I can get him to listen, would you pull your people back?" The chief's mouth pressed into a line. "Peace for food and supplies. Enough for our winter. But—" He leaned slightly closer, and Elias caught the smoke of cedar on his breath. "If your sheriff fires first, the drums will not stop until Cedar Bluff is ash." A bird lifted from the willows, wings snapping. Elias heard it a split second before another sound, faint, but enough to chill him. Gunfire, distant, but not far enough. It came again, 2 shots, then a third. Echoes rolled down the valley. Elias felt the weight of it land in his chest. "That'll be Maddox," he said, though it was more to himself than anyone else. The chief's gaze didn't waver. Then you have little time. Choose your path. Rancher. Ride back to your lawman and stop his hand, or stay and bind this truce before the flames reach both our homes. It was the kind of choice that split a man down the middle. He could ride back now, push Jasper hard, and maybe reach Cedar Bluff before the shooting became killing. But that would leave the chief without the supplies, without a gesture strong enough to cool blood already heating. The next time they spoke might be across rifles, or he could stay, send word later, trust that someone else could hold Maddox back. But if no one did, the first shot in town would roll back here like thunder, and the valley would answer in kind. Jasper shifted under him, hooves grinding in the riverbed. Elias's hands tightened on the reins. "I can get you food," he said. "Beans, cornmeal, flour, more than you asked for, but I can't carry it all now." "You have until sundown," the chief said. "After that the drums speak for themselves." Another gunshot cracked the air. This one closer. Elias's jaw locked. "Toman," he said, turning to the younger man. "You can move faster without me. Take the buckboard from my place, load it from the barn, and get it here. Every sack you can carry. You've got my leave to break every lock in town if it means filling it." Toman's brow furrowed. "And you?" Elias looked east, toward the ridge. "I'm going to stop a fool before he gets us all killed." The chief's expression was unreadable, but there was a weight to his nod. "Ride hard. Speak truth." Elias spurred Jasper up the far bank, water streaming from the gelding's legs, and cut a hard line back toward Cedar Bluff. The sound of the drums followed him, low now, not yet the furious pounding of war, but steady, like a clock ticking down. The land blurred under him, dry grass, frost patches, the dark line of the cottonwoods. As he crested the ridge above the town, the noise reached him first, shouting, the snap of gunfire, the sharp whinny of horses. Below, in the main street, Maddox stood with a knot of armed men, their rifles braced against the hitching rail. Across from them, half hidden behind the livery, Elias could see a handful of warriors, bows in hand but not yet drawn. Between them the dirt was empty, a no-man's land waiting for someone to be the first to fall. Elias pushed Jasper down the slope, hooves throwing clods. Heads turned, shouts rose, but he didn't slow. He reined in hard between Maddox and the livery, the horse dancing under him. "What in hell do you think you're doing?" Maddox barked. "Stopping you from making this a bloodbath." Elias shot back. "The chief's offering peace for supplies. You fire now. You'll bring every warrior in the hills down on this town before nightfall." Maddox's lip curled. "Peace? They've been testing our edges for weeks. Your beggar friend's been marking houses for raiding." Elias leaned forward in the saddle, voice cutting low. "Those marks were warnings. You're too blind to see it. They want food, Maddox. That's all. You give it. This ends here." Behind the sheriff, one of the deputies shifted uneasily. The townsmen looked at each other, their bravado dimming under the weight of what Elias was saying. "You're a fool," Maddox said. "We show weakness. We're finished." "No," Elias said, his voice hard as the iron in his hand. "You pull that trigger, you're finished. All of us are." The air between them stretched thin. Maddox's hand twitched near his rifle. Elias felt the moment poised on a knife edge. Then from the street behind him, a sound cut through the tension, the rumble of wagon wheels. Elias turned just enough to see Toman driving the buckboard hard, sacks of grain and flour piled high, barrels tied down with rope. He hauled the team to a stop in the empty space between the two lines, dust rising in the cold air. He didn't say a word, just cut the rope and let one of the sacks fall open, beans spilling across the dirt. The wind caught the scent of them, carried it into both crowds. The warriors lowered their bows first. One stepped forward, picked up a handful of beans, and met Elias's gaze. Maddox swore under his breath. His hand fell away from his rifle. Elias looked back toward the ridge beyond town. For now, the drums were quiet. But he knew they were listening. He also knew that whatever came next, there was no going back to the way things had been. The sun dipped low over Cedar Bluff, laying long shadows across the street where, hours earlier, rifles had been ready to speak. The buckboard was gone now, rolling toward the hills with its load of grain and flour, the dust of its passage drifting like smoke in the cooling air. Maddox had retreated to his office without a word, his men scattering in twos and threes, each carrying the unspoken weight of what nearly happened. Elias stood alone by the hitching post, hands resting on the worn wood, watching the horizon where the hills met the sky. Somewhere beyond them, the drums would start again someday. He knew that. But today they had gone silent, not from fear, but from a choice made before the first shot was fired. He thought of the chief's eyes, steady and unflinching, of Toman's quiet nod, of the beans spilling into the dust, a simple thing that had meant more than all the rifles on either side. Out here, peace never lasted forever. But sometimes, for one cold day at the edge of winter, it lasted long enough. And for a man like Elias Boone, that was worth the cost.